Hello everyone, this is Defense Politics Asia, and this is the summary for the day of 743 for the 7th of March. And there will be timestamps. You can check the description, or there should be chaptering. If you want to skip to the front line that you're interested in, just go ahead and skip. And we're going to start off with the frontline changes, and there's only one frontline changes over the past 24 hours over at Krasnohorivka at the Donetsk Front. The Russian claims that the Russian sources continue to claim that the Russians are attacking over at Krasnohorivka, and this time round they expanded their control slightly over along the railway line in the southern districts. So this is a continuation of the Russian forces attacking in this area here. We will continue to monitor. So it's just this little bit of land. So we will continue to monitor and see how this progress. And we're going to proceed to the frontline, the strategic and tactical reporting over at the Kherson Front. At the Kherson Front, there is fighting reported. Probably at Krinky, because the Ukrainians did not specify where. They say that the Russians conducted one assault against the units on the bridgeheads. So probably Krinky, maybe not. And so that's all for this fighting region. The Russians did report them shelling the Novo-Tiahinka. Novo-Tiahinka got shelled. And that's all over the situation at the Kherson Front. Over at the Zaporizhzhia Front, this is the Zaporizhzhia Front, there is fighting reported in the Kharkiv sector. The Russian forces conducted some rather more expensive attack in the area of towards Novodanilivka, at Robotine, in the western part of Verbove, and at Verbove. So the Ukrainian forces counterattack over at the Robotine region. This is a continuation of what the pro-Russian sources are reporting, that the Ukrainians are trying to attack towards Novoprokopivka. And on top of this situation over here, the Ukrainians are accumulating forces over at Novodanilivka. So in this area here, they are now accumulating forces, and this is expected by the Russian side to reinforce or double down on the attack over at Robotine to push the Russians entirely out of the settlement, because currently the Russians still have some positions over within Robotine itself, and another force will be pushing towards Verbove. So this is the current expectation of what is to come over the next few days. And according to Ryba, they said that this is the one that is reinforcing over this area is the 1st Rifle Battalion of the 5th Brigade. So this is redeployed from the Poltava region. So we will continue to monitor. The Russians are seemingly pushing towards Novodanilivka, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, and probably they detected this force over at Novodanilivka, which is why they are conducting a fire attack against the Ukrainian forces over at this region here, while the Ukrainians are actually concentrating on Robotine. The Russians are attacking in the Verbove region, trying to continue to close up. There is some rumors. I did see some headlines. I'm not sure from which YouTuber, claiming that the Surovikin line has been recaptured. It is not true, at least not from DPA's perspective, because if you look at the Surovikin line in the DPA's mapping, this line is still under Ukrainian control. This line is under Ukrainian control. So this is definitely still under Ukrainian control. The Ukrainians still have part of the Surovikin line, and there is of course the outpost, the forward line over there in this area here. So there is this lines that is still not captured by the Russian forces. So no, I would not call this a recapture of the Surovikin line. So anyway, that's all for the situation. There's one more thing. Over at Stepove, the Russians are also pushing. So at the Kayamsky sector, there is fighting reported towards Stepove. So this is something similar to the one towards Novodanilivka over here. So anyway, it's not something major. It's just some probing attacks probably. So that's all from the Zaporizhzhia Front. And over at the Donetsk Front, this is the Donetsk Front. At the Donetsk Front, the Russian forces are attacking in multiple directions, and it does feels like a possibility, maybe not, maybe yes, but just a possibility that the Russians are trying to conduct something bigger over here. There's fighting reported towards Novodarivka, Staromayorsky, Uruzhaine, Shevchenko. The Ukrainian forces counterattack at Vodian. The Russians are still attacking at Novomihailivka. Ukrainian forces counterattack. Russians are pushing at Bobeda. Ukrainians are also counterattacking at the same place. Russian forces are attacking Georgievka. Ukrainian forces counterattack towards Marinka. Russian forces attack towards Krasnohorivka. So this is the strategic situation that we are looking right now. And you probably can spot that the Russians seems to be pushing a little bit more over in this Velika Novosilka sector. There is this suspicious push over at Shevchenko. Ukrainians are seemingly conducting this major counter-offensive action over at this Marinka sector. Particularly, there is a push towards Vodian over here, or in the area of Vodian, and then there is this counter-offensive pushing in multiple different directions against the Russian offensive in the Marinka sector. And so I find this really, really intriguing. The Russians are conducting counter-artillery actions in Novoukrainka, north of Prashestivka. So it's a bit interesting if you look at this general picture over in this Donetsk Front. And particularly if you zoom in a bit more over in the Marinka sector, you can see that the Russians are pushing towards Georgievka, as well as pushing northward towards Krasnohorivka. The Ukrainians are pushing towards Marinka, and this is actually acknowledged by Ryba. They are talking about Marinka, and the Ukrainians are trying to push to try to cut the push towards Georgievka in their rear. The Russians are pushing in the Bobeda region or Boyeda region, probably trying to link up or straighten the lines towards Georgievka, while the Ukrainians are pushing towards Boyeda. The Russians are actually trying to cut off the Ukrainians at Novomihailivka, with the Ukrainians trying to push back in this area here. So the situation here is a lot of flanking movement on both sides. They are both trying to flank each other. Particularly for the Ukrainians. So the Russians are trying to flank at Novomihailivka. The Ukrainians are trying to flank at Marinka. So these two different flanking actions is very, very interesting. We will continue to monitor. But the Russians are conducting some... they are really throwing the airstrikes literally everywhere. Just on Krasnohorivka alone, there is two different geolocation of very heavy bombing. Allegedly, according to the military summary, they say that it's a 1,500 kilogram bomb over at Krasnohorivka. There is also airstrikes reported in Georgievka as well. So you will see a lot more also on other front line where the Russians seems to be throwing a lot of airstrikes all over the place. So very, very interesting situation. You see, one of these airstrikes also lands at Uruzhaine. So these are the multitudes of airstrikes that is being thrown, and these are just the ones that is being geolocated. So probably there is a lot more, and probably most likely there is a lot more. And that's all from the Donetsk Front. Over at the Avdiivka Front, the Russian forces offensive, the Avdiivka offensive has turned into Avdiivka defensive. As I mentioned, the entire offensive trying to take advantage of this Ukrainian routing has entirely failed, and this has turned into some kind of a defensive operation right now, because the Ukrainians are now on the offensive, trying to push back against the Russians over at Stepove, Bedaichi, over at Olivka, Tonenke, Vodian, and Povomaisky. So the Ukrainians are now on a full-fledged counter-offensive to push the Russians back. So there is the entire operation on the Russian side has turned defensive, as far as I can tell. So, but of course, this does not mean that the Ukrainians have it their way. The Russians do still have advantage in terms of rocket artillery, barrel artillery. They have advantage in terms of helicopter support and airstrikes. So, and drone wise, there might be some kind of a even out from my sensing, because the Ukrainians have sent really a lot of reinforcement into this area here, into this front line, to try to hold this line, because this is a fragile line. Like I mentioned, this line has been very fragile because they never expected this to fall. So the Russians should have taken advantage of this area, and they failed to do so. Maybe underestimating and also not bringing enough reinforcement in terms of drone surveillance, Lancet drones. So, or maybe they expanded it all, while they are trying to conquer Avdiivka. So when they're trying to conquer Avdiivka, maybe they expanded all of them. So as a result, they did not have enough to do this breakthrough. So either way, the Russian offensive is now bogged down tentatively, particularly over at the Badaichi region, Olivka region, as well as Tonenke. All of them kind of did not really go anywhere. Geolocation of Russian FPV drone attacks over in the eastern part of Badaichi, as well as flamethrowers, the flamethrower system over at this northern part. So these two attacks simply just show that the Ukrainians have most of Badaichi right now, and the Russians are on the verge of getting pushed out of Badaichi, and if they are pushed out, then they have to fall back to Stepove, which is another very hard to defend position. So the Russians will have to defend using all these three lines to their advantage. So that is the reality of the situation. And in fact, even the Russian Defense Ministry have acknowledged that the Ukrainians are attacking Petrovskoye, which is either Stepove or this small little settlement, which is basically similar. So the Ukrainians are now conducting offensive into this direction, and this is already acknowledged by the Russian Defense Ministry. So the Ukrainians are flanking towards the rear. So it is very interesting to see Ukrainians doing a lot more flanking operations, which they previously don't. Maybe this is the new commanders effect, the Sirsky effect. So previously, Ukrainian operation seems to be a bit more static. So we are seeing a lot more flanking operations. So I think that's also something very interesting to take note. So that's all for the Avdiivka Front. We shall continue to monitor and move on to the Niu-York Front. At the Niu-York Front, things has also gone spicy over this area here. Russian forces are attacking in the Mayorsk region as well as New York. Ukrainian forces are attacking at New York as well and at Pivdene. So the fighting over here seems to have grown a bit. It's getting a bit more fiercer as fighting is being reported all over. Russian Defense Ministry is mentioning most of this fighting over here. Let me check. So all the information is coming from the Russian Defense Ministry. So we will continue to monitor and see what is the situation in this area here. And that's all from the Niu-York Front. Over at the Bakhmut Front, this is Bakhmut city. Over the Bakhmut Front, Russian forces continue their offensive in this area here, particularly over at Ivanivsky, Klishevka, and Andreevka. So these are the main areas that the Russians are pushing. So no frontline changes situation in this area here. There is an airstrike reported over at Ozeranivka. So that's one thing. And then another airstrike reported in the northwest of Ivanivsky. So like as mentioned earlier, there is a lot of airstrikes conducted by the Russians. It seems like the Ukrainian surface-to-air missile system that has been redeployed. So for my assumption, my hypothesis is that the Ukrainians have sent reinforcement in terms of surface-to-air missile systems into the Eastern Front, and all these air defense system has been successful in shooting down all these Sukhoi 34s. And so if assuming that those are true, and this is actually somewhat corroborated, of course there is not a lot of evidence to show the shooting down of the Sukhoi 34s. However, it is through the destruction of a lot of surface-to-air missile systems in the eastern part of Ukraine that is actually geolocated, that prove that there is really a deployment of surface-to-air missile systems that into the eastern Ukraine that can contribute to the shooting down of Sukhoi 34s. But suddenly, with all this, with the lack of Sukhoi 34s getting shot down and increase of Russian airstrike being geolocated, it might suggest that the surface-to-air missile system on the Ukrainian side is now exhausted again. in eastern Ukraine. So the Russians are again have free reign to drop as many bombs as they want. So this is going to hamper Ukrainian operations very badly, and actually improve Russians' offensive capability, to weaken the Ukrainians and actually create a breakthrough. Over at the Siversk Front, this front is also getting a bit spicy. This is Siversk city. The Russians are attacking below Horivka. The fighting against Sperne continues, and there is a new threat coming from Rozdolivka. So the Russians are now attacking in 3 different directions. The Ukrainians means that they have to split up their reinforcement in 3 different directions as well. And this is on top of Russian artillery strike on the Ukrainian artillery. So things are getting a bit precarious for the Ukrainians, and it seems like the Russians are getting a bit fed up with the lack of progress, probably over in the Zaporizhzhia Front and the Avdiivka Front, because they were having so much euphoria after getting so much big wins and routing the Ukrainian forces. Suddenly everything get bogged down. So it looks like the Russians are going back to their old ways again, to probe across all the front line and to stretch the Ukrainian logistics again, and hopefully create a breakthrough somewhere. And I think this is something that we are now probably witnessing, because of this various attacks is very, very unusual. Over at the Kreminna Front, clashes continue over at Terny with Russian and Ukrainian forces. Both claims to be defending. We will continue to monitor. Kreminna Front has gone into the dead front after a full year or more of endless fighting within the Serebransky forestry. Now I don't even know where the front line is right now, to be honest. This is what we have based on the previous information. But is it really still like this? Really not sure, because there's no more attacks or probing or scouting in this area here to cause a certain clash in order to get even any form of report of fighting in this forest region. So anyway, we will continue to monitor. And Svatove Front also seems to start to act again. Russian forces is now attacking Novoselivsky as well as Stemakivka. Both is reported by the Russian Defense Ministry themselves. Like I mentioned just now, over at the Siversk Front, the Russians seems to be expanding their operations to create more worries, more points of worries for the Ukrainians in order to stretch them again, which is exactly what happened just before the breakthrough at the Avdiivka Front. So this stretching is probably going to work out, because even in the Kupyansk Front, this is the Kupyansk Front, the Russians are still conducting operations at Sinkivka, clashing with the Ukrainians over there, and the Terbaivka situation started again. So 6th and 7th, after a pause on 5th, the Russians are still pushing over at Terbaivka, and the Terbaivka situation is reported by the Ukrainian Defense Ministry. So if we zoom out a bit, we're going to see that the Russians are pushing at Sinkivka. This is nothing special. This is has been the usual thing at Sinkivka. The Russians are pushing at Terbaivka, now at Novoselivsky and Stemakivka. So the added pressure on the Ukrainians over at this frontline region is going to force the Ukrainians to send in more reinforcement to these fronts to deal with this emerging threat. And this is going to draw away attention away from the Avdiivka Front, which is where the Ukrainians are currently doing massive offensive, counter-offensive operations against the Russian breakthrough. So this is going to be very, very exciting for us, as viewers or observers of this war. But it's going to be tremendously difficult for the Ukrainian side. Over at the Kharkiv Front, there is 2 geolocations. One is an airstrike that I mentioned. Airstrikes is now everywhere on Ukrainian warehouse, called, at least that's what is described, at Budaki, and another one is just at the border, FPV drone attack against Ukrainian infantry over at this border region near the Russian town or village of Nekotiva or Nekotivka. So anyway, not very, very significant thing. It is nothing to be surprised about. So that's the situation over at Kharkiv Front. So anyway, this is the summary for the day of 743 for the 7th of March. So just some conclusions. So just to sum up, the Sitrep, the Ukrainian forces are conducting a massive counter-offensive operations, particularly over at the Avdiivka and the Donetsk Front. So at the Avdiivka Front, the Ukrainian forces are taking advantage of the failures of the Russians to take advantage of their offensive operation, because the Ukrainian forces previously was routed from the Avdiivka city, and it was even captured on video of Ukrainian forces trying to run away from encirclement, and then they got bombarded. A lot of very bad PR videos. And however, the Russians did not manage to take advantage of this chaos, and instead the Ukrainians managed to get into positions and build up a good artillery support or fire support line, and then they sent in reinforcement and managed to hell the Russian forces. And in fact, this is exactly the situation. A lot of pro-Russian viewers are very, very triggered. Left a lot of comments saying that I'm pro-Ukrainians. I mean, you guys are not pro-reality. That's not up to me. Anyway, the Ukrainian forces counterattack now at Svatove, Berdaichi, at Avdiivka, Tonenke, Vodian, and Pervomaiske is a huge feast. This is a huge punch back at the Russian forces, despite the Ukrainian Defense Ministry continue to claim that the Russians are attacking at Berdaichi, Avdiivka, Tonenke, Pervomaiske, and Nevelske. But you can see that this is so much more concentrated, and the Ukrainians are definitely trying to push back the Russians. And at least what they're trying to do is that to re-establish that initial line of defense over at Berdaichi, Avdiivka, and Tonenke. Leshchokini might be a bit hard, a bit too forward towards the Russian positions right now over at Avdiivka city. But this this line over here, I think the Ukrainian forces could possibly retake back if the Russians are not careful. Currently, the worst situation is over at Berdaichi, because just by geolocation, we have a Russian drone attack showing that the Ukrainians actually is already over on the eastern part, which means that the Russians are only taking in the southeastern part of Berdaichi, and if this got pushed back, they have to fall back into the Svatove line, and this is going to be back to square one, where the Ukrainians actually have their strong defense line before the fall of the Avdiivka city. And over at the Avdiivka situation, this is slightly better for the Russians. This is one of the better ones among the three villages the Ukrainians are pushing. So there's not much details about this, but Tonenke is not that strong. The Russian stronghold in this area here is very small, and maybe only up to this point. The Ukrainians actually have most of this settlement, and they are definitely now pushing back. And the Russians may have no choice. If they are unable to hold this, they will have to fall back to Zhivany, and Zhivany is not really a town that you can actually hold. So, but of course they have these three lines, but let's see how this progress. The Ukrainians are trying to do their best to push back the Russians and establish a strong line around here. The same counteroffensive seems to be happening over at the Donetsk Front region, with the Ukrainian forces attacking Marinka, trying to cut the Russian push over at Kharkivka, attacking the rear of this push in this direction, and they are also attacking Boyeda, Novomihailivka, as well as in the direction of Vodian. So these are the various push that the Ukrainians are trying. Of course, the Russians are also attacking in this area here. They are pushing in multiple directions. So this is it's basically a battle of chess, like battle of chess. They are pitting strategies against strategies and see how this goes. Another major clash is over at Niu-York Front. This is a very, very underreported front line. For those that are not watching DPA, you probably or have not been following DPA, you may not even heard of this front line much at all. So because DPA covers everything, so which is why people who follow DPA would have been familiar with the Niu-York Front. The Russians are fighting in the New York region and towards New York. Ukrainians are attacking Pivdeny and New York region, and this has been a continuation of a series of Ukrainian attack in Sumy region, even at Pivnishny towards Mayos, but majority of the fighting is over at Pivdeny and New York, and the Russians seems to be triggered, and then they are now conducting offensive to try to push back in this area here. This may develop into something bigger. Because the fighting may get fiercer and fiercer. So we will continue to monitor, but these are all part of the same Ukrainian push. New York, Avdiivka, Donetsk, maybe South Donetsk. So the Ukrainians are trying to push back. And the Russians, seeing the entire offensive getting bogged down over at the Avdiivka Front, and not just Avdiivka Front, but also in the Zaporizhzhia Front, where at the Kharkiv sector salience over here. This is also one of the part where the Ukrainians are conducting counteroffensive over at the Robotyne region, and they have already sent in reinforcement at Novodanilivka, and it was rumored that they will attack back at Svatove direction and send in more reinforcement towards Robotyne to push the Russians out of Robotyne. And the Russian forces are now conducting expanded operations, perhaps to try to stabilize the situation in their favor, attacking Robotyne in the direction of Novodanilivka in the west of Verbove and at Verbove. So this is to counter the Ukrainian potential operation that is going to come at this time soon, maybe in the next few days. So we will continue to monitor, but as I mentioned, this is an expansion of Ukrainian operations to try to counterattack. Russian forces are expanding the operation at Zaporizhzhia, and this is not just the only one. They have also started to trigger a new, more stretchy front line. You know, they're trying to stretch the Ukrainian forces. Attacking at Bilohorivka is continuing. Then they started to attack Sperne over the past 2 days, and now Rozhdolivka as well. So this is just one of it, and they are also stretching the Ukrainians by restarting the Svatove Front. So the Svatove is over here, and they are attacking in the Novoselivsky region and Stemakivka. And this is on top of what happening just north of it. So this is the two that were just mentioned, and they are also continuing to attack over at Trbivka region, while the main clash is still happening over at the Sinkivka region. So with this view, if I zoom out in terms of the strategic situation, you'll be able to see that the Russians are restarting Svatove Front, while the clashes is over at this area here. So Svatove and the Trbivka region, and then they are starting the Siversk Front, and then there is this clash over at Niu-York, while the Ukrainians are counterattacking at Avdiivka and over at Donetsk Front. The Russians are, of course, pushing. They're pushing at the Donetsk Front as well. So Ukrainians are trying to push against at the Zaporizhzhia Front. The Russians are trying to push back, and the Russians are also trying to initiate something new over at the Novoselivka region. And you can see that the Russians are now stretching the Ukrainians across the entire front again. So the at the Velika Novoselivka sector, I forgot to mention in this conclusion, is that the Russians are also stretching the Ukrainians by putting more attention over at Novodarivka, Staromayovsky, and Uruzhaine, and there is this very suspicious attack at Shevchenko. So all in all, the Russians are counter-attacking. So both sides are actually acting both at the same time. They are both trying new strategies and trying to outperform or outmaneuver each other. So it's going to be very interesting to see who will come out on top, at least for the next week or two, to see who will gain the initiative. So now both sides are moving, both sides are trying to plot against each other and maneuver each other. So it's going to be very interesting for the next few days. So anyway, thank you for watching. Do press the like button, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next update.